So with the Ant-Man trailer expected to arrive in theaters in the next few weeks or so, we're going to do a video discussing the character, but what we're going to do is we're going to focus on Scott Lang in this video. And the reason why is because Scott Lang is going to be the version of Ant-Man that we're going to see in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We'll see Hank Pym, but Hank Pym won't be playing the role of Ant-Man, and so it makes sense that we would focus on Scott Lang with regards to this character discussion. Now initially, Scott Lang had first appeared in Marvel Comics in the Avengers issue number 181, but the problem here is that this initial appearance isn't given any context. He's simply a character that just appears when we see the Cyclops and Beast arrive at Avengers Mansion and are immediately attacked by some sort of metallic tentacles that, as they explain, have the same kind of physical strength as Thor. But once they arrive inside, they see someone who is effectively tampering around inside of the building, and they immediately attack, but they're told to stop by Tony Stark, who explains to them that this person is Scott Lang and that this person is working on Tony Stark's security system. Now, in order to understand how it is that we got to this place with Scott Lang, we have to jump back to his, I guess, chronological first appearance, or in terms of his historical appearance in Marvel Comics, with Marvel Premiere issue number 47 in 1979. And what this does is it gives us Scott Lang in relation to his character evolution, in relation to how it was that he became an employee of Tony Stark. And what we learn in this story is that Scott Lang was previously in prison. He had been serving a 5-year stint for armed robbery, or for robbery in some degree. And what we see here is that Scott Lang is being released from prison on good behavior. Now, the relationship between himself and the warden isn't necessarily something we'd expect to see in any real world kind of scenario. They seem to be on very good terms, and in fact, the warden says he recognizes the good behavior that Scott Lang has been demonstrating, and that because of this, he set up an interview with Stark International for Scott Lang. And so what happens is Scott Lang undergoes the process of working for Tony Stark, and he's very adept at what it is that he does. Because he's a genius with electronics, he impresses Tony Stark with his knowledge. But the problem here for Scott Lang is that while all this is taking place, his daughter, Cassandra Lang, has been diagnosed with a heart condition, and this heart condition will most likely kill her. There is something going on in her heart whereby one of her valves is being blocked by a very thin membrane, and this membrane is keeping the appropriate flow of blood from going where it needs to go, which of course will end up in her death. And so what Scott Lang begins to do is to ponder the idea of going back to crime, because of the fact that regardless of the kind of pay raises that he's getting from Stark International, the fact remains that he's simply not able to pay the medical bills here. And so what he does is he begins going about the process of canvassing different houses, of looking at different houses with which he can later on break into. One of these houses, of course, belonging to Hank Pym. Now, before he actually turns to a life of crime, he is informed that there is a woman named Dr. Sondheim, and this woman has basically created a process whereby she can surgically go through and eliminate this blockage in the heart of Cassandra Lang, thereby curing her of her ailment. And so what Scott Lang does is he goes to meet with Dr. Sondheim, but as soon as he does, she is kidnapped and he is overpowered by a group from Cross Technological Enterprises. Now, we don't really know what the purpose is behind why it is that she's kidnapped, but for Scott Lang, the idea here of him being able to speak with her, of him being able to perhaps persuade her to maybe take on the task of helping Scott Lang's daughter without any sort of charge, is basically beyond his capabilities at this point. There's really nothing he can do to try to rescue her. And so what he does here is he basically decides to take the road to commit crime. He decides to go back to square one again. And what he does is he goes back to Hank Pym's house after it being one of the houses that he had canvassed. And when he breaks into the house, he realizes that this house does belong to Hank Pym, something that he was previously unaware of. But he also comes across Hank Pym's armor, his Ant-Man armor. Now, by this point, Hank Pym has abandoned the role of Ant-Man and has taken on the role of Yellow Jacket. And so that's the reason why this armor sits unused in a cabinet. And so what Scott Lang realizes is that he can take this armor and he can play the role of a superhero, and he can rescue Dr. Sondheim. And by rescuing her, he can put this armor back, or perhaps turn himself in, no harm, no foul, and he can basically avoid the role of being a criminal and having to go back to prison again. And so what he does is he dons the armor and he begins experimenting with it. He begins seeing whether or not it can work the way that it's supposed to, if he can actually control the armor, which of course he's successful in doing. And so what we do is we switch to Marvel Premiere issue number 48. And with issue number 48, we see that as Scott Lang is breaking into Cross Technological Enterprises, he comes across Darren Cross. Now, Darren Cross is in the middle of a surgery, and what he explains to Scott Lang is that the reason behind why Dr. Sondheim was kidnapped was because Darren Cross had the same heart ailment as Cassandra Lang, as Scott Lang's daughter. And so his intention here was to kidnap Dr. Sondheim and force Dr. Sondheim to perform surgery on him to eliminate this membrane along the valves of his heart that would in turn cure him. And so what happens is Scott Lang tries to fight Darren Cross, but he's immediately overpowered, and Darren Cross throws him in prison, throws him in a cell. And so what Scott Lang does is he takes out some of these antennae that he had hidden away, and he uses the antenna to call for backup from other ants, as well as shrinking down to his ant form. And what happens is that when guards arrive to either check on him or remove him from his cell, he grows back into his normal form, immediately overpowers the guards, and goes back along the process of attacking Darren Cross once more. And what happens over the course of the conflict between both Darren Cross and Scott Lang is that while they're fighting, Darren Cross effectively kills over. He simply just dies. And so what happens here is Dr. Sondheim informs us that when Scott Lang had initially interrupted the surgery, that Dr. Sondheim had taken the time while everyone was distracted and Darren Cross was unconscious to reinstall Darren Cross's old heart. And so when Scott Lang and Darren Cross were fighting one another, Darren Cross's heart gave out and Darren Cross ended up dying here. And so what happens as we progress towards the end of this story is that Scott Lang eventually is traveling back, or I guess does travel back to the hospital with Dr. Sondheim, and he encounters Hank Pym. And then his initial intention here is to confess, to tell Hank Pym what it is that he's done, which he does do. But what Hank Pym tells Scott Lang is that when Scott Lang had first arrived at Hank Pym's house and taken his armor, that Hank Pym was watching him the entire time, albeit in his smaller form, and that Hank Pym had followed Scott Lang to see why it was that he had stolen his armor. And while Hank Pym had initially been subdued by the security systems at Cross Technological Enterprises, that he was aware enough to see what it was that Scott Lang was doing and why it was he had taken the armor of Ant-Man. And so what Hank Pym tells Scott Lang is to keep the armor, that he can take on the role and maintain the role of Ant-Man, but only as long as he does it for the greater good. And so what we see over the course of Marvel Comics in relation to Scott Lang is that he plays a multitude of different roles under the role of Ant-Man. Of course, he is part of the Avengers for quite some time, but he also fights alongside Alpha Flight, and he fights alongside the Fantastic Four. Now, ultimately, the role of Hank Pym comes to an end when he is presumably killed during the Avengers Disassembled event, which is, of course, a series that you can watch here on my YouTube channel. But this is done when some variation, perhaps even the real Jack of Hearts, appears after being, I guess, controlled by the Scarlet Witch and blows up the Avengers mansion and Scott Lang along with it. And so what we see here is that Scott Lang is gone for a little while, but what happens is that Scott Lang reappears. Scott Lang comes back to the landscape of Marvel Comics during the Children's Crusade, during the Avengers branch off. And what happens here is that his daughter, Cassandra Lang, is taken into the past along with Scarlet Witch and a couple other characters. And while the initial idea here is that their corporeal form cannot interact with physical people in this time, Cassandra Lang somehow manages to break this barrier, and she physically encounters her father. And when she does, Scott Lang leaves the scene, and he's not killed by Jack of Hearts, thereby allowing him to remain in existence in the main Earth 616 timeline. Now, this is something that's been heavily contested by a lot of Marvel fans, and the reason why is because Marvel's been on again and off again about branch universe theory. For the most part, it's really just based on the writers. There are some instances where the actions of some individuals will create an alternate universe, that action being, of course, the assassination of Charles Xavier, which led to the Days of Future Past timeline. But in this instance, the fact that Scott Lang had, encountered his daughter, who in turn led him away from the Avengers mansion shortly before Jack of Hearts blew up, did not create a parallel reality. Instead, it allowed the mainstream reality to follow suit and for Scott Lang to stay alive. But for the most part, Scott Lang has been a relatively popular character in the realm of Marvel Comics. He's been a character that in a lot of different ways has been someone that a lot of fans can identify with, both on a personal level in terms of his physical struggle, but also the idea of a character who had fallen from grace and who had found redemption. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, let me know, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.